All right. Hello, everybody. We're going to start on a new topic today, which is basically the case study of the Vietnam War. And it's an extension of the Cold War really outside Europe because this conflict took place in Asia. So if you have your textbook with you, please turn to chapter 9. And we're going to start from page 98. All right. Now, for this part of the lesson, I'm going to give you a brief background of Vietnam, uh, somewhere just before World War II, and also during World War II, so that you understand the background of the conflict and why later on the war broke out in 1954. Now, basically, some background of Vietnam, or actually at that point in time, it was known as Indochina. So during the colonial period, which is during the 18th and 19th centuries, the modern state of Vietnam was actually part of French rule because the French actually colonized the area. And the area basically was known as Indochina. So if you look at the map over there, you can see that Indochina consisted of a few countries like Cambodia, Laos, and of course, Vietnam was part of this Indo-China. Now, French rule in Vietnam was very brutal. And even though the French introduced Western education and healthcare, basically the nature of colonization was that, the French rulers were really exploiting the land for their own benefit. So the locals experienced heavy taxes, and the colonial powers, which is the French, basically was trading items such as salt, opium, rice, and alcohol, and literally really exploiting the land and treating the locals very harshly. And of course, there were locals that tried to rebel, but the French would then, of course, deal with these rebels and would destroy them and kill them. So you can see in this picture over here, the heads of local rebels who tried to poison the French army in 1908. And what the French did was they actually beheaded the locals and then paraded their heads to really send a signal to other locals not to resist French rule. Now, during World War II, if you can recall, Germany defeated France in 1940. And so now the question was that what's going to happen to all the French colony, especially those in Asia, lah. If you can recall again, Japan was allied with Germany. So what happened was that Japan then invaded the northern region of French Indochina in September 1940. And what happened was that after Germany defeated France in Europe, Germany was able to form, in some sense, an alliance with a government in France known as the Vichy government. And the Vichy government, in some sense, ruled France, but they were actually partners with Germany. And this Vichy government then also had an agreement with the Japanese. Okay, and basically the Japanese could station their forces in French Indochina. So, as mentioned, Vichy France was aligned to Nazi Germany, so it allowed Japan to station their troops there. Now, because of what happened during World War II, there were resistant groups that basically sprung up in French Indochina. And one of the most important resistant group that emerged to resist the French and also to resist the Japanese was the Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh. So you can see a picture over there, that's Ho Chi Minh. And during World War II, the Viet Minh received money, weapons, and supplies from the US, the USSR, and the Kuomintang government in China, because these three so-called organizations and countries, they were fighting the Japanese, right? Now, the Viet Minh was essentially a nationalist movement, And inside the Viet Minh, there were different groups of people. So one group, there were the non-communists who wanted to drive Japan out of Vietnam and wanted self-rule. But inside the Viet Minh, there were also the communists. And the communists also wanted to establish an independent state, but obviously the communists wanted the state to be communist in nature. So remember, there are two groups actually within the Viet Minh, right? The non-communists and the communists. Now, towards the end of World War II, of course, Japan was losing the war already. The Viet Minh actually entered the city of Hanoi and declared Vietnamese independence. And when World War II ended in 1945, the French came back wanting to rule Vietnam again, but now they face resistance, all right? Because obviously the locals don't like the French coming back to rule them again. So anyway, this is an interesting so-called speech by Ho Chi Minh when Ho Chi Minh actually declared Vietnam independent. And what Ho Chi Minh did was that Ho Chi Minh actually borrowed ideas from the Declaration of Independence of the US era. And basically, you can see that he's making the ideological claim that all men are created equal, they have rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Essentially, what Ho Chi Minh is saying is that the locals want to rule themselves. They do not want to be under any colonial master. They do not want to be under the French rule anymore. Now, 1 year later, 16th of December 1946, war actually broke out between the French and the Viet Minh. And it all started in this place known as Haiphong, right, whereby the French naval vessels actually bombed the area, causing several thousand civilian casualties. And the Viet Minh then attacked the French troops in Hanoi in December. And so war broke out. And do take note, this is known as the First Indo-China War, starting in 1946. Now, at the same time, what the French did was that the French then set up a non-communist government in south of Vietnam, headed by former Emperor Bao Dai, to kind of like try to win local support, all right? During this period of time, in 1949, the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong defeated the pro-US Kuomintang and established a communist government in China. So you can see in this picture over here, Mao Zedong actually at Tiananmen and basically declaring that the Communist Party had won the Civil War, and now China was being ruled by the CCP. Now, this is important to note because once China became communist in 1949, obviously China was searching for allies. And communist China started to support the Viet Minh, okay, and gave them food, gave them medical supplies, and even Soviet-made weapons. And Mao even supported Ho Chi Minh with military advisors and training, because obviously you want to help your fellow communist brother. So in the picture, you can see there Mao Zedong actually talking to Ho Chi Minh. Now, what about the USA? Now, obviously, the USA was fearful that communism was spreading, not only just in Europe, was fearful that communism might be spreading all over Asia as well. And the USA thought that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh were controlled by the USSR. In other words, the USA wrongly assumed that the USSR was like plotting to, in some sense, spread communism all over the world. And so what the USA did was that the USA started to provide weapons and supplies to the French. Hopefully, if you give the French enough supplies, the French can then defeat the Viet Minh. So the US began to pour 500 million a year into the French war effort. Unfortunately for the French, the war did not go well for them. So basically, in 1954, a large, well-armed force of French troops were defeated by the Viet Minh during the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And in some sense, this marks the end of the first Indo-China War, or the first Vietnam War. And you can argue that the French obviously were defeated. And after the defeat, basically they met in Geneva for a conference in May 1954. And in this conference, obviously, they were to discuss many things, but one of the issues was, how to deal with Vietnam. And in this conference, we have the French, we have the Viet Minh, the USSR, China, US, and Britain, all coming together to discuss, especially about what to do with Vietnam. And so in the conference, it was agreed that Vietnam was going to be divided into two so-called territories. And they're going to be divided along the 17th parallel line. So we can see in this map over here, this parallel line here divides the two countries, North and South Vietnam. So the communists under Ho Chi Minh will now then dominate North Vietnam, and the non-communists under this new leader, Diem, will dominate South Vietnam. And the agreement at Geneva was that, you're going to let the North and the South have their territories, but in 1956, basically Vietnam will be unified. And it was agreed that how are you going to do this? There's going to be elections. People are going to vote. And basically, hopefully, they'll vote in for a government, and this government will then lead Vietnam. All right, so that was the plan. Later on, you will realize that this plan did not carry out. These elections were not carried out, but this was the plan at the Geneva conference. Now, what happened then during the 1950s after so-called the divide? So in the early months of the regime, actually thousands fled from North Vietnam in fear of communist rule. So there were people that were not satisfied with the communists. So if they were living in North Vietnam, they fled to South Vietnam. But on the other hand, there were actually Viet Minh soldiers and even supporters of Ho Chi Minh and the communists in South Vietnam. And so some of them would then flee to North Vietnam. So during the early years, thousands of people were actually moving. Either you're going to move to the north or move to the south, depending on who you are actually loyal towards. Now, why was Ho Chi Minh and why were the communists so popular? Well, many Vietnamese recognize that Ho Chi Minh was a great leader. Why? Because he fought against the Japanese and the French. So many people think that he was a great military leader. And they were also attracted by Ho Chi Minh's economic policies. Now, one of Ho Chi Minh's policy was that he introduced land reforms. And in these land reforms, land was actually confiscated from the large landowners and then redistributed to the peasant farmers. In other words, now the peasant farmers are receiving land. And so obviously, this policy was very popular with the farmers. Do take note, however, when this occurred, there was a negative impact on agricultural output, and agricultural output actually declined. And there were famines actually in North Vietnam. But from a peasant point of view, this is good. Not that the famine is good, but receiving land was a good thing. So that's why Ho Chi Minh was popular among the peasants. During the land redistribution policy, you can see in this so-called picture over here, many landlords were placed on show trials. What is a show trial? Really is a public trial whereby the objective is to make an example of the offender rather than ensuring justice. And you can see in this picture a trial of a landlord in North Vietnam in 1955. So everyone knows who the landlord is. The landlord is also humiliated in some sense. And it was really, really, in some sense, quite a brutal policy, at least for the landlords. So violence towards the landlords, there was a huge violence. Many of them were executed. But of course, the landlords, many of them were fighting back. So there was a lot of violent resistance. However, Ho's land reforms and his harsh treatment towards his opponents meant that North Vietnam was for the most part politically stable, because what Ho Chi Minh was doing was that he was really getting rid of his enemies. And so once your enemies are removed, then slowly the country starts to become somewhat stable. What about Diem in South Vietnam? Well, Diem, during the 1950s, tried to implement some modernization programs. For example, construction of a university, expansion of agriculture. However, his regime was quite unpopular because he was very autocratic, behaving somewhat like a dictator. And his regime, he also would frequently imprison and sometimes execute his opponents. So his regime was quite violent as well. And so, therefore, he was quite unpopular with a lot of the masses. And so I established, in some sense, the background of Vietnam. And after we have established this background, then we're going to basically move on to the next part of the lesson, which is why did war break out between North and South Vietnam in 1964? And this will be the essential question that we need to ask ourselves, because in the O levels, they will ask this question, why did war break out in 64? And we will cover this the next time. All right. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.